The little black girl knocked beside the freight shed, telling the biker someone forced her mom into a locked trailer. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's incredible story. Imagine this. It's a warm afternoon at the local freight yard, where the sound of heavy trucks rumbling and the smell of oil and metal fill the air. The workers are finishing up their long shifts, and the sun is beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the scene. But amidst this calm, something unusual is about to happen. A little black girl, no older than 8, comes running through the yard, her face streaked with tears. She's barefoot, her dress torn at the hem, and her eyes are wide with panic. She's frantically searching for someone, anyone, who can help her. She runs toward a group of bikers sitting by their motorcycles, taking a break from their long ride. Without hesitation, she stops in front of the nearest biker, tugging at his leather vest. "Please," she cries, her voice trembling. "They took my mom. They locked her in a trailer." The biker, a seasoned man named Jake, looks up in shock. He's seen his fair share of trouble over the years, but this was different. He stands up, his face hardening. He glances around at the other bikers, who are all now paying attention. They've seen this girl running toward them with desperation in her eyes, and they know it's not a time for questions. Jake kneels down to the girl's level, his voice calm but firm. "Where is she, kid?" he asks. The little girl points shakily toward a rusty trailer at the far end of the yard, her small body trembling. "They put her in there," she whispers, "and they won't let her out." Jake's heart sinks. He knows this neighborhood. He knows the kind of people who live here, and this doesn't sound like something he wants to get involved in. But something about the girl's pleading eyes, the way she's clutching his vest with a grip that's almost desperate, tells him that this is no ordinary situation. Without another word, Jake motions for the other bikers to follow him. The group mounts their bikes, and the engines roar to life, echoing through the yard. As they speed toward the trailer, the little girl follows behind them, walking as fast as her tiny legs can carry her. The bikers are serious, and they know that time is of the essence. Every second counts when it comes to saving someone's life, especially when that person is in danger. The trailer looms ahead, dark and foreboding. As they approach, Jake can see that the door is locked. No sign of anyone inside. But the air feels thick with tension, like something bad is about to happen. He can't shake the feeling that they're walking into a trap. But it doesn't matter. These bikers, they're loyal to the end, and if a kid needs help, they'll do whatever it takes to protect her. Jake steps up to the door, pounding on it with his fist. "Hey," he calls out, his voice rough and steady. "Open up." There's a long pause before a voice from inside responds. "Who the hell are you?" The voice is gruff, full of authority. Jake doesn't flinch. "We're the ones who are going to make sure that little girl's mom gets out of there," he replies, his tone cold and unyielding. The voice inside laughs, a low, mocking sound. "You think you can just walk in here and make demands? This is our turf, buddy." Jake's jaw tightens. He knows this is going to escalate. But he's not backing down. Not now, not ever. "Get the hell out of the way," he says, stepping forward. "Or things are going to get real ugly, real quick." The bikers gather around the trailer, ready for whatever comes next. The little girl is standing beside them, clutching her hands together, her wide eyes watching everything unfold. She's scared, but she knows she's not alone anymore. And that's what matters. The bikers stand in front of the locked trailer, their engines rumbling, ready for whatever might come next. The little girl is beside them, her face still streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she grips the leather of one of the bikers. Jake, the leader of the group, steps forward again, this time more confidently, his jaw set. He pounds on the door once more, harder this time. "Open up," he calls again, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Inside, there's a long pause, then a shuffle of movement from behind the trailer door. The same gruff voice from before speaks out. "You think you're just gonna bust in here and get what you want?" Jake doesn't flinch. He steps closer, his eyes never leaving the door. "You've got two options. Open this door, or we'll open it for you. Your choice." The voice inside hesitates, clearly unsure of what to make of the bikers outside. Jake's crew stands behind him, the tension palpable, all of them on high alert. The little girl watches them, her eyes wide with fear and hope. She knows the bikers are her only chance, and she's counting on them. The door swings open suddenly, and a man steps into the doorway. He's tall, broad-shouldered, with a menacing look on his face. His eyes are cold, and he stands there, blocking the entrance to the trailer. Jake doesn't hesitate. He steps forward, his voice steady but firm. "Move aside," he orders. The man grins, showing a mouth full of crooked teeth. "You're not getting in here. This is our place, and I don't take kindly to people who try to mess with it." Jake's fists clench, but he knows better than to get physical right away. Instead, he takes a breath and gives a subtle signal to his crew. They move into position, surrounding the area. The man's smirk fades slightly as he realizes that the bikers are not backing down. Jake's calm voice cuts through the tension. "You have two options, like I said. You can let us in peacefully, or we can come in and handle this our way. Either way, that girl's mother is getting out of here." The man eyes him carefully, clearly calculating his next move. For a moment, there's silence, and then the man steps back, slowly, but not without throwing one last challenge. "You think you can just waltz in and take someone? I've got friends. You'll regret this." Jake doesn't flinch, his eyes never leaving the man's. "We're not asking for permission. We're taking what we came for. And if you've got friends, they better stay out of this." The man, realizing that the situation isn't going in his favor, reluctantly steps aside, motioning for the bikers to enter. Jake nods to his crew, signaling them to move forward. The bikers step past the man, their boots thudding against the ground with authority. The little girl follows close behind, her eyes now filled with a mix of fear and relief. Inside the trailer, the air is thick and stale. The room is dimly lit, with old furniture scattered around haphazardly. It's clear this place isn't the home anyone would want to be in. The mother lies on the couch, unconscious, her body pale, and her breathing shallow. Jake kneels beside her, checking her pulse. It's weak, but it's there. "She's alive," he says, standing up. He looks at the little girl, his eyes softening. "We'll get her out of here. I promise." The little girl nods, her eyes still full of uncertainty, but filled with hope now, knowing she's not alone. The bikers quickly assess the situation. One of the crew members, Wrench, moves toward the kitchen, looking for any signs of food or medicine. Meanwhile, another biker, Diesel, checks the rooms for any other threats or signs of trouble. The tension doesn't fully dissipate, but there's a shift. The bikers have made it inside, and now, their focus is on getting the mother to safety. Jake pulls out his phone, making a call to the nearest hospital. "We've got a woman who needs immediate care. We're on our way," he says briefly, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around him. The bikers begin preparing to leave, knowing that time is critical. They lift the unconscious woman carefully, placing her gently onto one of the bikes. The little girl is helped onto another bike, her small frame securely strapped in. "We're gonna get you both out of here," Jake reassures her. The engines roar to life again, and this time, it's not just the sound of motorcycles. It's the sound of rescue, the sound of a promise kept. The bikers lead the way out of the trailer park, moving quickly and with purpose. As they ride, the little girl clings to the back of the bike, her mind racing with thoughts of what's next, but for the first time, she feels like she's safe. The road ahead is uncertain, but one thing is clear: she and her mother are no longer alone. The bikers roar down the highway, the wind whipping through their hair as the little girl holds tightly onto the back of the bike. The mother, still unconscious, is carefully secured behind another biker, Diesel, who keeps his eyes on the road ahead, never faltering. The engines hum like thunder, and the crew moves in perfect harmony, focused and determined. They're heading to the hospital, but the situation isn't over. It's far from over. The thought of the man who locked the mother in that trailer still lingers in Jake's mind. He knows he won't rest until he finds out who's behind this. As they ride, the little girl shifts nervously, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds, her eyes still filled with anxiety. She's safe for now, but the memories of the terror she witnessed in that trailer are still fresh in her mind. Jake notices her nervousness and slows his bike down a bit, giving her a reassuring look. "You're safe now," he says, his voice soft but firm. She looks up at him, her eyes wide, still unsure if this is real. You promise? She whispers. Jake gives her a nod. I promise. The ride feels endless, but they finally reach the hospital, the bright lights cutting through the night like a beacon of hope. The bikers pull into the emergency entrance, and the crew immediately springs into action. One by one, they help the little girl and her mother off the bikes, moving quickly to get them inside. The hospital staff rushes to meet them, recognizing the urgency in the situation. Nurses and doctors immediately begin assessing the mother, checking her pulse, and getting her onto a stretcher. The little girl stands by, holding onto one of the bikers, watching anxiously as her mother is taken away. She's going to be okay, Jake assures her, his voice steady, though his heart is racing. But the little girl doesn't answer. She just nods, her small hands still trembling. A doctor pulls Jake aside, his expression serious. She's in critical condition, the doctor says. We need to get her stabilized, but she'll be okay. You did the right thing bringing her here. Jake nods, a small sense of relief washing over him. He glances back at the little girl, who's now sitting in a nearby waiting area, her head resting against the armrest, exhausted from the ordeal. It's been a long day, and they've been through so much, but they're safe now. The bikers remain by her side, ensuring she has everything she needs. As the hours pass, Jake keeps a close eye on the little girl. He notices the look in her eyes, a mixture of fear and uncertainty, but also a flicker of hope. She may have been through a traumatic experience, but she's strong, and she's not alone anymore. The hospital staff comes and goes, checking on the mother's progress. Jake and the other bikers stay in the waiting room, talking quietly among themselves. They know they can't leave until they know the mother is stable, and the man who locked her in that trailer is brought to justice. The night stretches on, and as the first light of dawn begins to break through the hospital windows, the doctor returns with good news. She's stable now, the doctor says with a relieved smile. We're going to move her to a room, and she'll need some time to recover, but she's going to be okay. Jake exhales deeply, a weight lifting from his shoulders. He looks over at the little girl, who's now sitting up straighter, her eyes less clouded with fear. She smiles slightly, the first real smile Jake has seen from her since all of this started. He walks over to her, kneeling down so they're eye to eye. She's going to be okay, he says, offering her a reassuring smile. The little girl nods, but Jake can tell she's still processing everything. What's your name, kid? He asks softly. She looks up at him, her small voice barely above a whisper. Maya, she replies. Maya, I'm Jake, he says, extending his hand. You're going to be all right, I promise. Maya hesitates for a moment before taking his hand, the first step toward healing. As the sun rises higher in the sky, Jake knows this chapter is far from over. The man who locked Maya's mother away isn't off the hook. But for now, they've done what they set out to do. They've saved a life, and they've given Maya the chance to live a life free from fear. And that's all that matters. The sun had barely risen when Jake and the crew gathered outside the hospital, their motorcycles lined up in perfect formation, engines purring as the first light of the day broke over the horizon. The mother, now stabilized, was resting comfortably in a room, and Maya was by her side, looking more at peace than she had in days. It had been a long and exhausting night for everyone, but the job wasn't over yet. Jake knew that the real fight had only just begun. The man who locked the mother away still roamed free, and Jake wasn't about to let that slide. He had made a promise to the girl, and he was going to keep it. As the bikers prepared to head out, Jake gathered them around, his voice calm but full of resolve. We're not done yet, he began. The bastard who put her through all this is still out there. We need to find him and make sure he never does this to anyone again. Diesel, the biggest of the group, nodded. We'll find him, Jake. We always do. But it wasn't going to be easy. The man they were after wasn't some random thug. He was part of a dangerous network that had ties all over the city. Jake's mind raced as he thought about the possible connections and the danger they were about to face. They couldn't just barge in guns blazing. They needed a plan. They needed information. As the bikers mounted their bikes, ready to leave, Jake pulled out his phone and made a call. It's time to call in some favors, he muttered to himself. Maya stood at the hospital entrance, her little hand gripping the doorframe. She watched as the bikers revved their engines, preparing to leave. The sound of the bikes filled the air, and for a moment, It felt like the calm after the storm. But deep down, Maya knew that the storm wasn't over yet. She had seen too much, and she wasn't going to let what happened to her mother slide. She had a quiet determination in her eyes as she waved goodbye to the bikers. "Be careful," she whispered to herself, hoping that somehow they would bring her mother's abuser to justice. The crew rode through the city, their motorcycles slicing through the early morning traffic. They kept a low profile, trying to avoid drawing attention as they headed toward their first lead. Jake had reached out to one of his old contacts in the city, a former informant who knew the streets better than anyone. After a few cryptic conversations, they had gotten a tip. The man they were looking for was last seen in a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with tension as they approached the warehouse. The building loomed in front of them, a dark, foreboding structure that had clearly seen better days. The windows were boarded up, and the door was barely hanging on its hinges. It didn't look like much, but Jake knew that appearances could be deceiving. They parked their bikes a few hundred yards away, their eyes scanning the area. Jake motioned for the crew to stay close as they approached the building. No one spoke. Everyone knew the risks. They couldn't afford to make any noise. They weren't sure who was inside or what they were up against. The warehouse was eerily quiet as they crept inside, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. They moved carefully, checking every corner, every door. It didn't take long before they found what they were looking for. There, in the back of the warehouse, was a small office, and inside, they could hear voices. Jake signaled to the crew to get into position. "This is it," he whispered. They waited for a moment, listening to the muffled conversation from inside. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest, but he kept his composure. This wasn't the time for hesitation. He nodded to Diesel, who was closest to the door, and with a swift motion, Diesel kicked it open. The bikers stormed into the room, their presence sudden and overwhelming. The men inside froze, caught off guard by the unexpected intrusion. Jake stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. The man they were looking for was standing near the far wall, looking just as surprised as the others. Jake's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable authority behind it. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his tone cold. The man tried to make a move toward a nearby desk, likely to grab a weapon, but Jake was faster. He moved in, grabbing the man by the collar and slamming him against the wall. "You hurt that girl's mother," Jake said, his voice low and menacing. "And now, you're going to pay for it." The rest of the bikers spread out in the room, making sure no one tried to make a run for it. The tension was thick, but Jake's mind was focused. This wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure this man would never hurt anyone again. The man struggled in Jake's grip, but it was no use. He was outmatched, outnumbered, and he knew it. "You have no idea who you're messing with," the man spat, but Jake wasn't fazed. "Oh, I think I do," Jake replied, tightening his grip just enough to make the man understand he wasn't in control anymore. They had him, and now, they were going to make sure he faced the consequences of his actions. The bikers stayed there for what felt like an eternity, but eventually, the authorities arrived. The police had been tipped off, and Jake wasn't about to make this harder than it needed to be. They handed the man over, making sure he knew exactly who had brought him to justice. As the bikers rode away, the weight of the situation didn't quite lift from their shoulders. But they knew one thing for sure. They had kept their promise. And they had done it together. The sun was setting as Jake and his crew rode back to the hospital, their mission now complete. The man who had locked Maya's mother away had been handed over to the authorities, and justice was starting to take shape. But even though they had won the battle, Jake knew the war was far from over. There was still so much to do, so many lives that needed protection, and a world full of people who were vulnerable. The crew rode in silence, the road stretching ahead of them. The engine hums a constant reminder of what they had just done. As they approached the hospital, Jake's mind wandered back to the little girl, Maya. She had been through so much, and Jake knew that it wasn't just her mother that needed healing. The trauma she had experienced would follow her for years to come. As they parked their bikes outside the hospital, Jake looked over at Diesel, who was already getting off his bike. "We've got to check on her," Jake said, his voice low but steady. Diesel nodded, understanding without words. Together, they walked into the hospital, the familiar smell of antiseptic and the hum of fluorescent lights greeting them as they entered. Inside, they found Maya sitting in a waiting room, her head resting against the wall. She was no longer crying, but her face was still filled with uncertainty. She looked up as the bikers entered, her eyes scanning their faces, searching for something. "Maya," Jake said softly, sitting down beside her. She looked at him for a moment, her small hands clutching the edges of her seat. "Is she okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake gave her a reassuring smile. "She's going to be all right. They're taking care of her." Maya's shoulders slumped in relief, but there was still something in her eyes. Something that hadn't fully eased yet. "What happens now?" she asked. Jake looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of the question. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her face this alone. "Now, we make sure you're safe," he said. "You're not alone anymore." Maya nodded, but there was a lingering doubt in her eyes. Jake could see it, the fear, the uncertainty. It would take time for her to heal. It would take time for them all. But for now, she had people who cared, people who would fight for her. Later that evening, after Maya had been settled into a room with her mother, Jake and the bikers gathered outside the hospital, their bikes parked in a line. The cool evening air felt like a small relief after the intense day they'd had. As they stood together, the bond between them was stronger than ever. They were family, not by blood, but by loyalty, by shared experiences, by the unspoken understanding that when one of them needed help, the others would be there. "What's next, Jake?" Diesel asked, his voice quiet, but carrying a sense of resolve. Jake looked out at the road ahead. He had no illusions about what the future held. There would always be more battles to fight, more people to protect, but for now, they had done something important. They had saved a life. They had kept a promise. And that was enough. "We keep riding," Jake said finally, his voice steady. "We keep riding, and we keep looking out for the ones who need us. Because that's what we do." The bikers nodded in unison, the resolve in their eyes matching Jake's. They had done their part, but the work was never truly over. There were always more people who needed help, more people to protect. As they fired up their engines and prepared to ride off into the night, Jake felt a sense of purpose settle deep in his chest. He had found something he never expected, a family, a mission, a reason to keep moving forward. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but Jake and his crew were ready. Together, they were unstoppable. The bikers rode for hours, the cool night air rushing past them as they made their way out of the city. The hum of the engines was a constant, comforting sound, and the road stretched endlessly before them. They had just done something incredible. They had rescued Maya and her mother, and they had taken down a man who had been a menace to both of them. But despite the victory, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He knew that the world they lived in was full of people who didn't care, people who would take advantage of the weak, people who would hurt others without a second thought. It was why he had always chosen this life, to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And now, with Maya safe and her mother in the hospital, he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't stop now. The crew had been quiet for the ride. They all had their reasons for doing what they did. Diesel, Wrench, Clutch, and the others all had their pasts. But there was one thing they shared. They all knew what it meant to stand by someone in need, to be there for each other no matter what. As they made their way to a small diner just off the highway, Jake signaled for them to pull over. The neon lights of the diner flickered in the darkness, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The bikers parked their bikes in a line, their leather jackets gleaming in the dim light. Jake removed his helmet, running a hand through his hair as he walked toward the entrance. He pushed open the door, the jingle of the bell overhead signaling their arrival. The diner was quiet, save for the hum of the jukebox playing softly in the corner. A few truckers sat at the counter, their conversations low and murmured. The waitress behind the counter glanced up, giving them a quick once-over before smiling warmly. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice friendly, but Jake could tell she was wary. The bikers were used to that kind of look, people who were afraid of them because of their appearance. But none of them were here to cause trouble. They were here to get some food and figure out their next move. Jake nodded toward a booth in the back. "We'll take a seat," he said, his voice calm. As they sat down, the waitress brought over menus, her eyes still lingering on the group. Jake scanned the room, his mind still working. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut that things weren't finished. Maya was safe for now, but she had a long road ahead of her. And what about her mother? Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the waitress returning, asking if they were ready to order. Diesel smiled at her, his deep voice rumbling as he ordered a burger and fries, and the rest of the bikers followed suit. They ate quietly, but their minds were elsewhere. Even in this moment of peace, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, more to the situation than what they had seen. He didn't trust the man they had taken down, and he definitely didn't trust the people he was connected to. As they finished their meal, Jake stood up and motioned for the others to follow. He paid the bill, leaving a generous tip, and they made their way back to the bikes. The night was still young, and there was more to do. But as they pulled back onto the highway, the weight of the night still hung heavy on Jake's mind. He needed answers, and he was going to get them. It wasn't just about protecting Maya and her mother anymore. It was about making sure no one else would fall victim to the same kind of abuse. As they rode back into the city, the lights of the skyline shining ahead of them, Jake knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and they would face more challenges, but he was ready for whatever came next. The crew was stronger than ever, and together, they would make sure that no one else suffered the way Maya and her mother had. They would protect the vulnerable, stand up against the darkness, and fight for what was right. It was a promise they had made to themselves, and to the people they had sworn to protect. The bikers rolled into the city just as the night began to settle. The streets were quieter now, the city's lights casting long shadows on the pavement. Jake felt the weight of the night settle on his shoulders. They had just finished taking down one monster, but there was another lurking in the shadows. The man they had captured, the one who had locked Maya's mother away, wasn't working alone. Jake could feel it in his gut. There was more to this story, more pieces of the puzzle yet to fall into place. They parked their bikes near an old warehouse, the same one they had scouted out earlier in the week. Jake knew this place. It was where some of the city's most dangerous people did their business, hidden away from the world. It was a place where nothing good ever happened. As the crew gathered around, Jake looked at each of them, his gaze steady and determined. "This is it," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. "We're not just walking in here to take a look around. We're here to find out who else is involved in this. We're going to make sure that whatever happens next, it ends tonight." Diesel nodded, cracking his knuckles. "Let's get it done," he muttered, his deep voice steady. The crew moved into position, their leather jackets gleaming in the dim light, their boots heavy against the concrete. They moved quickly, no sound but the echo of their steps in the hollow warehouse. Jake's heart beat faster as they approached the door. This was it. They were going to confront whatever, or whoever, was behind the nightmare that had almost torn Maya's world apart. Jake reached for the door, his fingers brushing the cool metal. He pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the warehouse was dark, the shadows hiding the truth in every corner. The air smelled of dust, old machinery, and something foul that Jake couldn't quite place. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, they heard voices. Low, murmured conversations, but no one could be seen. The group stayed in formation, their eyes scanning every inch of the room. Jake motioned for Wrench to take the left side, while Diesel and Clutch took the right. He himself moved toward the back, where he thought the voices were coming from. As he moved closer, the conversations grew clearer. He could hear one man's voice, low and grating, full of anger. "I told you, we can't just keep doing this," the voice said. "We're going to get caught." Another voice, calm and calculating, responded, "If you don't shut up and follow the plan, we'll all end up in prison. We take the money, we get the hell out of here, and we never look back." Jake's blood ran cold. He knew those voices. They were the ones who had been working with the man they had captured. But these voices, these men, they were the ones pulling the strings. The ones who had been behind the abuse, behind the locked trailer. And now, they were in Jake's sights. He signaled to his crew to move forward, and without hesitation, they moved in. The men inside didn't hear them coming. They were too focused on their plan. Jake stepped into the room, his boots echoing in the silence. "You've been running this city for far too long." Jake's voice cut through the tension. The two men froze, their eyes wide as they looked at Jake and the rest of the bikers who had appeared in the doorway. The man who had been speaking earlier tried to reach for something hidden in his jacket, but before he could make a move, Diesel was on him, pinning him against the wall with a grunt. "Not so fast," Diesel growled. "You're not going anywhere." The second man took a step back, his face pale as he realized they were outnumbered. Jake stepped forward, his eyes locked on the man's. "This is the end for you," Jake said, his voice cold and firm. "You've been hurting people for too long, and it stops tonight." The man swallowed hard, his hands trembling. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his voice shaky. "You think you can just take us down like this? You have no idea who you're messing with." Jake didn't flinch. "I've dealt with worse," he said simply. "And tonight, it's your turn." The bikers closed in, their presence overwhelming. The men knew they had no chance. They had been exposed. It was over. Jake stood there for a moment, making sure the weight of the situation settled in. These men had hurt innocent people. They had caused pain and suffering. And now, they were going to face the consequences. The bikers kept watch as Jake made another call to the authorities, informing them of the situation. "We've got them," Jake said into the phone. "Get down here. We've got a big haul for you." As they waited for the police to arrive, Jake's thoughts drifted back to Maya and her mother. They were safe now, and that was all that mattered. But Jake knew that this wasn't the end. There were always more to protect, more people in need. And as long as he and his crew were around, no one would have to face the darkness alone. The bikers sat in the dimly lit diner, the clink of coffee cups and the hum of the jukebox filling the silence between them. Jake leaned back in his seat, his eyes fixed on the door, his mind still racing from the night's events. They had done what they came to do, taken down a dangerous group of men who had terrorized the innocent for too long. But despite the victory, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this. They had handled the immediate threat, but they knew all too well that the damage these men had done stretched far beyond what they could see. The sun had set hours ago, and the quiet hum of the diner was the only thing keeping them grounded. Diesel, ever the quiet one, broke the silence first. "What happens now, Jake?" he asked, his voice gruff but filled with the weight of the question. Jake didn't answer right away. He took a long sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle into his bones before responding. "We keep going," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't over. There's always more to protect, more people who need help. We've only scratched the surface." The rest of the crew nodded in agreement. They were used to this kind of work: rescue, protection, keeping people safe from the darkness that lurked in the corners of the world. But this job had hit them harder than most. Maya's face, her eyes filled with fear and hope, had stayed with them. Her mother's frail body, barely clinging to life, had been a stark reminder of the world they were fighting against. As Jake looked around the table, he knew they weren't going to walk away from this. "We've got to make sure Maya is safe," Jake continued. "We get her and her mother out of this mess, and we make sure no one like them can ever hurt them again." Clutch, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "What about the others? The ones we didn't get to?" Jake's eyes darkened. He knew what Clutch was referring to. They had taken down the men who had hurt Maya's family, but they knew there were others out there. The network was bigger than just a few criminals. They were dealing with a system of corruption, and Jake wasn't going to let it slide. "We find them," Jake said. "One by one. We take them all down." The crew was silent for a moment, the weight of Jake's words sinking in. They all knew what that meant. It meant more long nights, more dangerous confrontations, more battles. But it also meant that they were standing on the right side of things. They were fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. And as long as they had each other, they were unstoppable. "We do this together," Jake added. "No one's going to stand in our way." The bikers all nodded in unison. They had faced danger before, but this time, it felt different. This time, they weren't just a gang, they were a force for good. As the crew finished their meal, the conversation shifted back to their plans. They knew that the next step was to get Maya and her mother settled somewhere safe. A place where they could heal and start over. But Jake couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. There was still a sense of urgency in his gut, something telling him that the worst was yet to come. But for now, they had done what they could. They had protected the innocent, and that was enough. The rest could wait. As they paid the bill and walked back to their bikes, Jake's mind stayed focused. They were a family. They had made a promise to Maya, and they weren't going to let her down. With the sound of the engines roaring to life, the crew set off into the night. The road stretched ahead, dark and uncertain, but Jake knew that with his brothers by his side, they could handle whatever came next. There would always be more battles to fight, more people to save. But as long as they kept riding, they would always be ready. The following morning, the crew gathered outside the small, run-down motel where Maya and her mother had been settled. Jake had arranged for them to stay in a quiet, secluded spot, far from the chaos of the city. They needed time to recover, to heal. Jake had made sure of that. He stood outside the motel, his leather jacket fluttering slightly in the early morning breeze. He had just finished talking with the hospital about Maya's mother's condition. She was stable now, still weak, but she was alive, and that's all that mattered for the moment. The rest, Jake knew, could wait. He had given his word to protect them, and he wasn't going to break that promise. Diesel, Wrench, Clutch, and the others had spent the night securing the area, ensuring that no one would come looking for trouble. They had worked quickly, efficiently, as they always did. They were a well-oiled machine, and their bond was stronger than ever. Jake wasn't sure how long they could keep this up, but for now, they had a job to do, and they would do it together. He looked up at the others, who were gathered around the bikes, talking in low voices. "It's time to get moving," Jake said, his voice low and steady. The crew nodded, understanding without words. They had been through a lot together, but they still had unfinished business. Maya and her mother were safe for now, but there were still enemies to be dealt with. And Jake wasn't the kind of man to let things go unfinished. As the bikers started their engines, Jake's mind turned to the next step in their plan. He had been working on getting more information about the remaining threats. He had reached out to old contacts, piecing together the puzzle one clue at a time. The network that had been behind Maya's abuse was far-reaching, and Jake knew that this was just the beginning. There was more to this story, more corruption to uncover, more people who needed to be held accountable. As the group rode out of the parking lot, heading toward the next lead, Jake glanced back at the motel one last time. It was a quiet, lonely place, and it was the last place he wanted Maya to be. But for now, it would have to do. They had to stay under the radar, to keep things low-key. They couldn't afford to attract attention. The sound of their bikes was the only thing that broke the silence as they sped down the highway, heading into the unknown. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Jake knew they would face it together. He didn't know exactly what they would find, or how much more danger they would face, but he did know one thing. They weren't backing down. Not now, not ever. The crew had already faced down dangerous men, gone head-to-head with the darkest parts of the city. But the hardest part was yet to come. Jake's thoughts turned to Maya again. She had come so close to losing everything, but she was still standing. She was stronger than she knew. And Jake was going to make sure she didn't have to face anything like that again. As they rode on, the world seemed to open up before them, vast and full of possibilities. But Jake kept his eyes on the road, focused, determined. They had a mission, and it wasn't over yet. They would bring the people who hurt Maya to justice, no matter how long it took. The crew would stop at nothing to protect the innocent. As they neared the outskirts of the city, Jake saw the first signs of their next destination on the horizon. They had a lead on a man who had connections to the group that had been terrorizing Maya's family. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Jake's hand tightened on the throttle. It was time to finish what they had started. The next phase of their mission was about to begin. And this time, they weren't stopping until they had uncovered everything. The sun was rising higher now, casting a golden light on the road ahead. The city lay behind them, a place full of ghosts and memories they were ready to leave behind. Ahead, the future was uncertain, but Jake knew one thing. He was ready for whatever came next. They were ready. Together. The day had barely begun when Jake and his crew arrived at their next destination. They had tracked the man they were after to a small, seemingly inconspicuous building on the outskirts of town. It was a warehouse, tucked away behind a maze of empty lots and overgrown weeds. The building was old, its windows boarded up, the paint peeling and faded. But Jake knew better than to judge a place by its appearance. He had seen worse, far worse. They parked their bikes quietly, the engines dying down one by one, as the crew gathered around, ready for what was about to unfold. Diesel cracked his knuckles, Clutch adjusted the strap on his leather vest, and Wrench checked his gear. They were all on high alert, aware that this was no ordinary mission. This was the big one. The man they were after was tied to a larger network, a group that had been exploiting the vulnerable for years. Jake had no doubt that this warehouse was just a small part of a much bigger operation. He had no illusions about the dangers they would face, but he wasn't afraid. He had made a promise to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and he intended to keep that promise. "All right," Jake said, his voice steady but full of resolve. "We go in fast, we go in clean. We take him down, get the intel, and we get out. No exceptions. The crew nodded in agreement, moving swiftly into position. They approached the warehouse from different angles, careful not to make any noise. Jake led the way, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. They reached the back of the building, where a small metal door provided their entry point. It was locked, but that wasn't a problem for them. Diesel stepped forward, and with a few swift movements, the lock was broken. The door creaked open, and they slipped inside, the darkness swallowing them whole. Inside, the warehouse was cluttered with boxes, crates, and old machinery. The air was thick with the smell of dust and rust, and the faint echo of dripping water could be heard in the distance. It was the kind of place that felt wrong from the moment you stepped inside. They moved carefully, their footsteps muffled on the cracked concrete floor. Jake held up his hand, signaling the crew to stop. He could hear voices, low and grating, coming from deeper inside the building. They were close. Jake motioned for Diesel and Clutch to take the left side, while Wrench and he would cover the right. They crept forward, staying out of sight as they moved toward the source of the voices. As they rounded a corner, they saw him, the man they had been tracking. He was standing with two others, speaking in hushed tones, clearly unaware of the biker's presence. Jake felt his pulse quicken, but he didn't move yet. They needed to wait for the right moment. The man they were after was tall, well-built, with a sharp, cold demeanor. Jake could see the familiar look of a predator in his eyes. This was no small-time crook. This was a player in something much bigger, and Jake knew they couldn't take him lightly. He waited for the signal from Diesel, who had positioned himself on the other side of the warehouse. A few tense seconds passed, and then Diesel gave a subtle nod. It was go time. Jake stepped forward, his boots heavy on the floor, the sound of his approach breaking the silence. The man turned just in time to see Jake and the crew closing in on him. For a moment, there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced with a sneer. "You think you can just walk in here and take me down?" the man sneered. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Jake didn't flinch. "I know exactly who you are," he said, his voice cold. "And this is where it ends." Without hesitation, Diesel moved in, grabbing the man by the arm and slamming him against a stack of crates. The other two men lunged forward, but the bikers were ready. Wrench took one down with a quick, well-placed blow, and Clutch handled the other, pinning him to the ground with ease. Jake stepped forward, his gaze never leaving the man. "You're done," he said flatly. The man struggled against Diesel's grip, but it was useless. He was trapped. Jake could see the fear start to seep into his eyes. "I didn't do anything," the man growled, but Jake wasn't buying it. "You've been exploiting people for years," Jake said, his voice low and menacing. "And you're going to pay for it." The man's face twisted in anger, but there was nothing he could do. The bikers had him cornered, and there was no escape. Jake pulled out his phone and dialed the authorities. It was time to wrap this up. As the police arrived, Jake and the crew stepped back, allowing them to take over. The man was handcuffed and hauled away, his protests falling on deaf ears. As the bikers watched the police take him into custody, Jake felt a sense of closure. This was one more victory, one more promise kept. Maya and her mother were safe. The people behind the abuse were being brought to justice. But Jake knew this was just one chapter of many. The fight was far from over, but as long as they stuck together, they would keep fighting. They would protect the innocent, take down the monsters, and make sure no one ever had to face the darkness alone. The morning after their successful takedown of the criminals, Jake and the crew found themselves back at the same small motel, the morning sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. The air was crisp, a faint chill in the breeze as they gathered outside, the weight of the previous day still hanging over them. They had put an end to a dangerous chapter, but Jake knew better than anyone that this wasn't the end. The job was never done, and there would always be another fight, another battle to face. But today, they had done something important. They had kept their promise to Maya and her mother. They had put an end to the abuse, and they had brought justice. As the bikers gathered around their bikes, Diesel was the first to speak. "What now, Jake?" he asked, his voice steady. But there was a glimmer of uncertainty behind his eyes. Jake looked out over the empty parking lot, his thoughts racing. He had made a promise to protect Maya and her mother, and he intended to keep it. But he knew that the world wasn't so simple. There were always more people to save, more battles to fight. The enemies they had just faced were only a small part of a larger network. And Jake knew that no matter how many people they took down, there would always be more waiting to take their place. "We keep going," Jake said finally, his voice firm. "We protect those who can't protect themselves. We don't stop just because we've taken down one group. There's always more to do." The crew nodded in agreement. They had all seen the darkness that lurked in the corners of the world. They had all lost something along the way. But they had each other, and together, they could handle whatever came next. As the bikes roared to life, Jake felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with hitting the road. The crew was ready for whatever came next. But there was still a lingering doubt in the back of Jake's mind. There was always more work to be done. As they made their way down the highway, heading into the unknown, Jake's mind kept returning to Maya. She had been through so much, and yet she was still standing. She had survived the worst, but Jake knew that the trauma would stay with her for a long time. The question was, how would she heal from it? The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake was determined to help her find the peace she deserved. They had done the hard part, getting her and her mother to safety. But now, they had to help them rebuild. And that would take time. The crew had dealt with their own demons over the years. Each one of them had their own story, their own scars, and they all carried that baggage with them every day. But they never let it hold them back. They never let it stop them from doing what was right. And now, with Maya and her mother in their care, Jake knew that the crew had to be strong for them. They had to be the support system that Maya needed, the family she had been missing. As they reached the outskirts of town, Jake glanced back at the others. "We need to figure out where we're headed next," he said, his voice steady. "We can't stay in one place for too long. The people we've taken down have connections, and we don't know who's still watching." Diesel gave a curt nod, understanding the urgency. "Where are we going, Jake?" he asked. Jake thought for a moment, then turned his eyes toward the horizon. "We need to lay low for a bit, but we also need to find out who else is behind all of this. We're not done yet." The crew nodded, their resolve solid. They had come this far together, and they weren't going to stop now. They rode for hours, the miles stretching out before them, the highway winding through the empty countryside. Jake couldn't help but think about the future. He had never wanted to be a hero, never asked for this kind of life. But now that he was in it, there was no turning back. And as long as there were people out there who needed saving, he would keep riding. The crew would keep riding. And they would keep fighting the good fight. As the sun set behind them, the world seemed vast, full of endless possibilities. But Jake knew that no matter where the road took them, they would face it together. There was strength in their bond, a bond forged by loyalty, by the unspoken understanding that no one would ever have to face the darkness alone. And that was a promise they would keep for as long as they could. The road ahead was long, and they didn't know what awaited them, but Jake felt ready for whatever came next. Because with his brothers by his side, he knew they could handle anything. The crew continued their ride, the wind cutting through their jackets as they sped down the highway. The road stretched on endlessly before them, the sun sinking lower in the sky. The day's events had left Jake with more questions than answers, and the gnawing feeling that the worst was far from over was never far from his mind. They had tracked down a dangerous group of people and taken them out, but the network they had exposed was larger than they had anticipated. The truth was, they hadn't even scratched the surface. Jake's mind kept returning to Maya and her mother. They were safe for now, but Jake knew that the trauma of what they had been through wasn't something that would disappear overnight. It would take time, care, and support for them to heal. And that, Jake realized, was where he and his crew came in. They weren't just fighters or protectors. They were a family, and they were going to stand by Maya and her mother for as long as they needed. Jake glanced back at Diesel, who was leading the pack, his massive figure silhouetted against the orange hues of the sunset. The crew had a bond, one that went deeper than just the work they did together. It was built on trust, loyalty, and the unspoken understanding that no one would be left behind. The road ahead was uncertain, but Jake was sure of one thing. They would keep riding, no matter where it took them. As they neared a small town, Jake signaled for a stop. They pulled over to the side of the road, parking their bikes under the shade of a few trees. It was a quiet place, with nothing but the sound of distant birds and the occasional passing car. They had made good progress, but they couldn't afford to take things lightly. They needed to stay ahead of their enemies and gather more intel on the remaining threats. Jake took a deep breath and surveyed the area. This wasn't a place they could stay for long, but they needed to rest, to regroup. He wasn't about to put Maya and her mother in danger again. "We've got to find out who else is involved," Jake said, turning to his crew. "We know there's more out there, and I don't want any more surprises." Diesel nodded, his expression unreadable as always. "We've got your back, Jake," he said simply. The rest of the crew was already pulling out their phones, making calls, reaching out to their contacts. Information was power, and they needed as much as they could get. As the crew took a few moments to relax and rehydrate, Jake's mind wandered. It wasn't just about protecting Maya and her mother anymore. It wasn't even just about taking down the people who had been exploiting them. It was about something bigger. The system they were up against was vast and deeply entrenched, but Jake wasn't backing down. He wasn't going to stop until he had exposed every last person who was part of it. Maya's face flashed in his mind. She was just a child, and yet she had been through more than most adults could even imagine. The pain she had experienced was etched in her eyes, and Jake wasn't going to let her down. She deserved better than this world had given her. Was silent as they mounted their bikes, engines roaring to life once again. Jake took the lead this time, his mind focused on the task ahead. He knew the dangers they faced, but the feeling of riding with his crew, of being part of something bigger than himself, was the one thing that kept him going. As they rode into the night, the city lights beginning to fade in the distance, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were far from done, but they were making progress. They had started a journey together, and they were going to see it through. Maya and her mother were only the beginning. There were more people out there who needed saving, more lives to protect, and Jake wasn't going to rest until they had taken down every last piece of this network. They would keep riding, no matter the cost. Because together, they were unstoppable. The crew rode into the early morning, the roads growing quieter as the city faded into the distance. They had been chasing shadows for days, trying to unravel the remaining threads of the criminal network they had set out to destroy. Maya and her mother were safe for now, but Jake knew that their journey wasn't over. The battle had been won, but there were always more battles to fight. They had taken down a few of the worst players, but the system they were up against was vast, and there would be more to come. He glanced at Diesel, who was riding just behind him, his massive frame visible in the rearview mirror. Diesel was a man of few words, but Jake knew that the bond between them was stronger than ever. They had been through too much together to not understand what the other was thinking. The road was long, but it was also full of possibilities. With each mile, Jake felt the weight of their mission pressing down on him, but it was a weight he would gladly bear. They had made a promise to Maya. They had promised to protect her, to keep her safe from the dangers that lurked in the world. And they weren't about to break that promise. As they approached a small town on the outskirts of their route, Jake signaled for the crew to pull over. They needed to rest, to take a breath. The last few days had been a blur of action, chasing leads, tracking down the remaining threats, and dealing with the aftermath of their confrontations. Now, they needed to take stock, to plan their next move. They parked their bikes in front of a small diner, the flickering neon sign casting a dim light over the parking lot. The sound of the motorcycles dying down as the crew dismounted brought a moment of peace. Jake took a deep breath and looked around. The town was quiet, the streets empty except for the occasional passing car. It was the kind of place where nothing seemed to happen, a far cry from the chaos they had left behind. The diner door swung open, and a waitress stepped out, her eyes scanning the group with a mix of curiosity and caution. She had seen bikers before, but something about this group felt different. They weren't the kind of men who came looking for trouble. At least, not the kind that could be settled over a meal. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice friendly but reserved. Jake gave her a warm smile. "Just a couple of coffee refills for now," he said, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion. The crew made their way inside, taking seats at a booth in the back. The quiet hum of conversation and the clinking of silverware filled the air as the waitress brought over their drinks. As they settled in, the crew began to talk in low voices, discussing the next steps in their journey. They had dealt with the immediate threats, but there was still much to be done. Jake had made a promise to Maya, and that promise wasn't just about protecting her mother. It was about giving Maya the life she deserved, a life free from fear. That wasn't going to be easy. There were too many people like the ones they had just taken down, too many dark corners where the vulnerable were exploited. But Jake wasn't about to walk away. He looked at his crew, his brothers in arms, and he knew that they would stick by him, no matter what. "We keep moving," Jake said, his voice firm but calm. "We take down the ones who are still out there, and we keep protecting the ones who need us." Diesel nodded. "We ride until the job's done." Clutch, always the quiet thinker, gave a sharp nod. "One step at a time," he said, his voice steady. As they finished their coffee and prepared to hit the road again, Jake couldn't help but think back to where it all started. It hadn't been an easy journey. They had faced danger, betrayal, and violence, but they had also seen the best of what people could be. They had seen families brought together, lives saved, and the light of hope flicker in places that had long been dark. And that was why they kept riding. They weren't doing this for the glory or the recognition. They weren't doing it for the thrill. They were doing it because they had made a promise to protect the innocent, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. They were a family, and that bond would never be broken. As they started their bikes and roared out of the parking lot, heading into the unknown once more, Jake felt a sense of peace. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be more challenges, more enemies to face. But for the first time in a long time, he knew they were ready. Together, they could take on anything. And as the horizon stretched out before them, Jake felt a quiet determination settle in. This was their purpose. This was what they were meant to do. And no matter what came next, they would keep fighting. They would keep riding. Hell Angel stories take us on an emotional and thrilling journey through the lives of those who choose to fight for the innocent, no matter the cost. In this gripping narrative, a group of loyal bikers embarks on a mission to protect a young girl and her mother from a dangerous network of criminals. As the crew battles corrupt forces, they uncover the darkness lurking in their city, taking down one monster after another. With each chapter, the Hell Angels stories showcase the unwavering bond between the bikers, their sense of loyalty, and their relentless pursuit of justice. As they navigate through obstacles and face dangers head-on, they make promises to protect the vulnerable and ensure that no one else suffers at the hands of evil. The adventure continues, with more twists and turns, as the Hell Angels crew rides through the unknown, determined to keep their promise and fight for those who can't defend themselves. These stories are more than just tales of violence and revenge. They are a testament to loyalty, family, and standing up for what is right. Get ready for a thrilling ride through the lives of these modern-day heroes, as the Hell Angels stories unfold with intensity, grit, and heart. With each new challenge they face, their bond grows stronger, and their mission becomes clearer. No one will be left behind, and justice will always prevail.